Chapter 269 leaks just wrapped up, so let's summarize it. So if you don't want spoilers, back out now. Chapter starts off with Mei Mei at a small candy shop and she asks, "How much?" Then it pans back to the Jujutsu sorcerers checking on Yuta. Maki tells Yuta, "You bastard, don't think it's all sunshine and lollipops just because you're back to your old body." There's a little bit more chatting. Maki asks Megami how he's feeling. He starts to talk, but then Yuji pans in and says, "I have some things to apologize for." Then the absolute goat Kusakabe pans in. He says this is all Gojo's fault for not taking down Itadori in the first place. And Itadori isn't to blame because he's just a victim of Kenjaku turning him into a Jujutsu weapon. He used another word, but I'm not going to say it on here. The word revolves around what the USA is commemorating today, if you were curious. He said he was originally pro taking down Itadori, and you can thank Yaga for him being here. Follows that up with saying you kids shouldn't feel the least bit guilty. Y'all are all brats, feel free to act like it. This is the shame of us grown-ups. Alright, the next page we get Yuta explaining how he was able to get back to his body. I'ma just read the translations. Thank you again, Keidanada, for translating for us every week. Yuji says, "How were you able to get your body back, Akotsu?" Yuta says, "I have Rika to thank. I thought her not coming with me to Gojo's body meant our connection was severed. In reality, Rika was using reverse curse technique to consistently heal and maintain my body that was already treated by Shoko. I really thought it was over once Kenjaku's technique burnt out in the domain." Mei Mei says, "We can consider that a slight miscalculation. We thought that Kenjaku's technique would continue operating even after you opened your domain. It was likely an application of barrier techniques that allowed him to make use of the multiple curse techniques and actively separate them. It's obvious for someone who's used the technique for 1,000 years would be more precise than someone using a fresh copy." Yuta says, "After the technique recovered, I was in a state of suspended animation. But once I reconnected with my external storage of techniques, Rika, we eventually got here. I'm really sorry to have worried you all." Yuji, "Don't sweat it." Maki says, "The real problem here is that if Yuta conducted himself a bit more seriously, we would have won a hell of a lot easier." And Yuta gulps. We kinda get a play-by-play here. Maki says, "First, I should have led the surprise attack on Kenjaku. Then there's Higuruma's executioner sword plan. If we used Toge's remote curse speech, we could have ended things in a flash. Higuruma should have had the tape recorder on him." Narrator, "Curse speech cannot be activated more than once simultaneously. Until the recording is played, the technique is considered in use, which means only one tape recorder was allowed." Toto chimes in, "You're wrong, Maki. You can't be seen as a target for my boogie woogie. Betting on Akotsu succeeding in the surprise attack without my help would have been extremely risky. Not to mention Akotsu and Rika's power was necessary to stop the rampaging cursed spirits." Panda then says, "Plus Toge's cursed speech only worked because that timing made the reaction survivable. If we used it when Sukuna was feeling fine and dandy, Toge would have been taken out by the feedback. Toge, Salmon Row." Alright, you guys, this part's gonna be crazy. Be ready. "Higuruma's alive." Higuruma says, "Sukuna was just toying with me and he was capable of taking me out whenever he wanted, and if someone like Akotsu were there, he would have done so. Curse speech is easy to counter. I'm the one who decided it best to use it inside Akotsu's domain with no one else around to interfere. With no violence allowed inside my domain, that would have been impossible." Kusakabe said, "Still, it's pretty scary how a guy that's only been a sorcerer for 2 months is alive and kicking after all that. Higuruma, it wasn't intentional." The panels for these are great, by the way, you guys, so go check them out on the Discord. Yuji, with a bead of sweat on his face, is silent. Maki, "Regardless, the backup from abroad. Miguel being his extra self." Maki says, "If those two had been there from the start, things might have been different." Everyone, "That's true." Yuta, "They told me they weren't coming. I told you it was a long shot, Maki, and yet they came." Yuji, "Easy now." And I do apologize for this turning into a read-along, but there was a lot of talking in this chapter. Yuji says, "I couldn't have done this without Akotsu's tools covering my fingers," and he's talking about the gauntlets that he was wearing. Maki tells him he could have just got some gloves from Home Depot. Bakari chimes in saying they didn't skip a beat jumping Sukuna after Gojo was defeated, and that they were able to separate Urame from Sukuna very early on, and they have Akotsu to thank for that. Back to our little read-along. Toto says, "There's a lot I'm responsible for too. Working with Miss May had us prepared for Sukuna's domain, and yet Choso and my brother were still caught in it." Alright, I just about had a stroke trying to pronounce their name. It's been a long day and I don't feel good. But Kirara, our femboy baddie. Kirara says, "Isn't that a technique range issue?" Toto says, "It was more so an issue of Sukuna's cursed energy. It was too powerful in the eye of his domain, and I wasn't able to grab hold of their cursed energy." Mr. Shiesty himself, Ino, says, "I was in the eye too. Ui was able to spring into action and save me. I'm also to blame. I should have saved Choso." Yuji says, "It would have been over for me if that happened. It's no one's fault." Maki takes some blame, saying, I'm not trying to blame Yuta either. I mean, I got hit with 2 black flashes, but never mind. Yuta's a little puzzled. Miwa chimes in, saying that she was terrified, and she really wishes that she was able to support in the Sukuna raid, but Kusakabe says, I told you not to get involved. Momo also joins the conversation, apologizing for not being much help. Mei interrupts and says that her broom gave her a pleasant ride. Hikari says that he really wanted to join in on the fight with Sukuna after he finished off Arame, but he adds that, quote-unquote, they were strong. Nobara says, I was asleep until the end, so... Ui says, everyone has their regrets, but I think everyone can agree that I was the MVP. Kirara says, you left me behind mid-battle, and Ui says, you were heavy. Kusakabe tells Ui that he was very helpful, but his sister was just sitting back and relaxing. Mei has a little bit more to say, but Hikari chimes in. By new shadow, you mean dealing with the binding vow that prevents outsiders from learning new shadow? Kusakabe says exactly, then he brings up who created new shadow style. I may butcher this name, so I do apologize. Ashiya Sadasuna. Kusakabe says he created the binding vow with the intention to make simple domain inaccessible to curse users. Mei yaps for a minute, then essentially says that over time, new shadow style was hidden behind a paywall. So they monopolize the technique, invite disciples, and then have them undergo unnecessary binding vows. Mei and Kusakabe explain it in a little more detail, saying that students cannot decline orders from the head of the new shadow style. This part's a little interesting. There are rumors that the head of the new shadow style absorbed the lifespan from the students of new shadow style. Kind of a crazy little tidbit of information if you ask me. The system of new shadow style makes it almost impossible to find out who the head of it is. And if something ever happens to the head of new shadow style, one of the senior disciples will take their place. So kind of imagine it like a big gatekeeping scene. Kusakabe then adds in that the binding vows created by the head of the new shadow style can only be taken away by the head of the new shadow style. This translation wasn't 100% clear, so take it with a grain of salt. Kusakabe says that he's the current head of new shadow style, and the problem with it taking people's lifespans has been taken care of. Then Mei chimes in saying that she wants Ui to be the next head of new shadow style so that she can collect fees from each of the students. Then the chapter finally pans back to Mei at the very beginning of the chapter talking to the old lady at the candy store. The old lady asks Mei how much, and Mei responds, I'm taking the elder's life. The old lady asks her, how did you know I was here? How did you find me? Mei says, she asked somebody who knew, and they gave her the information. The elder then says, Tengen. Mei has some talk about the money. Mei says, with the Zenin clan annihilated, we stand on the cusp of a decisive battle wherein both the Kamo and Gojo clans will face destruction. But you know, things even more important than money can't be protected without the proper funds. There were sorcerers who would have managed to survive had your monopoly on the simple domain not been in place. More than anything, you were trying to turn my dear little brother into damaged goods. That alone made this an inevitability. Chapter ends. Editor's note, you pay the price with your life. Only 2 chapters remain. No break next week. Let me know your thoughts on the chapter down in the comments.